In the early 2000s, Kenny was just your typical high school senior. He did all the typical stuff that a lot of teenage boys at the time would do. When he wasn't in school, he was working on his car or he was hanging out with his friends, playing video games, going to the mall. Just typical teenage stuff. Now, Kenny, though, was a little bit different. His best friend was not one of the guys. His best friend was actually his neighbor named May. Kenny knew May ever since he was about 4 years old, and their families both had these pretty large properties that were about a quarter section of land each, so about a half a mile by a half a mile. And right at the back of Kenny's parents' property, just on the other side of the fence, was May's parents' property. So these two grew up together. They were completely inseparable, and pretty much wherever one would go, the other would follow. And that bond, that closeness, rang solid through their entire lives, pretty much from the time they had met. These two were very similar in a lot of ways. They both enjoyed the outdoors. In the summertime, they would go exploring through their parents' property. They would go on hikes. They would go camping. They would go fishing together. The families all together would go camping. They would go on trips together. In the wintertime, both of them are really into snowmobiling. So they would go snowmobiling together. And they were just completely inseparable. Although, even though they were so close and so inseparable, they really never developed any feelings for each other, never really started dating or anything like that. But that all changed at the start of senior year. It was almost like somebody flipped a switch and both of them realized, hey, you know what? They're pretty great and I'm starting to feel things for them. So they ended up talking and they actually ended up becoming officially boyfriend and girlfriend. And at first, their parents were completely thrilled because these two families were pretty inseparable themselves. And both sets of parents were basically thinking that, these two are so close. Chances are they're probably going to get married when they're older. We cannot see them breaking up. Like they're best friends. They have been all their lives. So life for Kenny and for May was really good. They had a lot of freedom because both sets of parents trusted the other. So they were allowed to basically go out whenever they wanted. They did not need to explain themselves. If they wanted to stay out late, they could. But that all changed a few months later. There was actually a big blow up between May's parents and Kenny's parents. And at that point, it was like that family bond that those two families had. It was like it just disintegrated, even though there were so many years of these families going away on trips and stuff together. This incident just completely shattered that bond between them. And both sets of parents very quickly kind of became against Kenny and May dating, almost like a Romeo and Juliet type thing. Like they were not forbidden to see each other, but they were also not really welcome at each other's houses. On top of that, these two were no longer able to just go whenever they wanted or stay out as long as they wanted with each other. They had to tell their parents where they were going, what time they would be back. And it was a real culture shock for these two because they never had to do that before. They grew up being able to hang out with each other as much as they wanted, as late as they wanted. So they were having a hard time accepting these new rules. But over the next few weeks and over the next few months, those new rules slowly started to become the norm, and they really did slowly start to accept that. But at the same time, they were kind of trying to rebel as well. They really wanted to see each other whenever they wanted. They did not want to have to explain themselves. They wanted to stay out late. They really missed being able to spend as much time with each other as they used to. So they started to develop a plan on how they would be able to go hang out with each other pretty much all night without their parents ever knowing. And they came up with this big plan that they would sneak out of the house. They would meet in the middle of the two properties, right where the two properties connected, right at the property line. And they would actually make a campsite. They would set up a tent. They could go there. They could spend the night with each other. And then early in the morning, they could make their way back to their houses, sneak in, and their parents would never know they were there. So these two, they started to put this plan into progress. They ended up meeting in the middle of the two properties. They ended up clearing out a whole bunch of brush. They made almost the perfect campsite. They brought a bunch of stuff out to it. They brought a bunch of rocks to make a fire pit so they can have a fire together. They brought out a tent. They set it up. They put a big tarp over the top just as extra protection for the tent. And they thought that their plan was perfect. They thought their parents would never find out. And they were really excited to go to this tent and spend a night together for the very first time. Over the next couple of weeks, though, whenever they did not have school, the weather was not really cooperative. They would plan to sneak out of their house, but it would be pouring rain or it'd be really strong winds, and it would be really hard to walk a half mile through the bush and sneak back into the house with nobody knowing. So they had to keep putting this off. But the two of them, they kept their eyes on the forecast, and sure enough, there was a Friday night coming up where the weather would be absolutely perfect. It was going to be clear skies, no rain, very light breeze. And the two of them, when they saw this, are like, this is a night that we're going to test out this tent. So they started making their plan for that Friday night. Once Friday night came, both of them around 10 o'clock, they said goodnight to their parents. They both headed up to their rooms. They waited a little bit. They heard their parents go to bed a short time later. And then they both knew that this plan was on. Kenny, while he was in his room, he heard his parents go off to bed. So he slowly got up out of his bed. He reached underneath. He pulled out a backpack. He put it on. Very quietly opened up his window, stepped up onto his bed, jumped outside, and then once he was on the ground, he reached up, he very quietly and slowly closed his window. Then he started making his way towards the bush line behind his parents' house. Once he got into the bush line, he pulled a flashlight out from his pocket and he started walking that half mile to where that tent was set up. The entire time as he was walking towards where the tent was, he had his flashlight up, he's looking into the trees. He was feeling a little uneasy, even though he spent a lot of time in the woods behind his parents' house. He didn't really walk around in them solo that often in the dark, and there were a fair number of bears in the area. There was even coyotes, so he was a little bit on edge of predators, but at the same time, he grew up in the country, so he was fairly used to it. But again, being solo, walking a half mile into the woods, completely unarmed, that's enough to make pretty much anybody feel a little bit uneasy. So Kenny, as he's making his way through the trees, he can feel his heart rate picking up. He does feel himself on edge. But very slowly, all of a sudden, he starts to get up closer towards the property line. He sees the tent come into view, and he knows that soon May will be there. And, that kind of got him through it. It got him to basically shake off his fear. Once he got to the tent, he unzipped it, he put his backpack in, and then he went about gathering up a bunch of sticks and a bunch of twigs to make a fire. He slowly got a fire going. Once the fire was going, he went into the tent. He actually went in, zipped it up because the mosquitoes at this time were actually pretty bad. He was not counting on that. When he made his fire, he was getting eaten alive, and he did not bring bug spray because it's just something he did not think of. So while he was in the tent waiting for May, he grabs his phone, sends her a text just saying, "Bring bug spray, the bugs are bad." He puts his phone back into his bag, and then he just laid there listening to the sounds of nature all around him, listening to the fire crackle outside. After a little bit of time had passed, he realized May should have texted me back by now. So he opens up his backpack, pulls his phone back out, looks, and he had no text messages from her. So at this point, he was wondering, okay, she has to have been walking here already. Maybe that's why she didn't get the text. So he really did not think much of it. He took his phone, he put it back in his backpack, he lied back on the sleeping bag, and he just continued to wait for May to show up. After about 10 minutes, she still had not showed up, but he did very slowly behind him, back in the direction of May's house, start to hear what sounded like footsteps coming through the woods closer and closer towards the tent, and he thought that had to be May. So he very slowly sat up, listening to these footsteps that got closer and closer and closer to camp, and at one point, these footsteps stopped pretty much right behind the tent. He sat there listening. He did not hear any more footsteps. So he started to wonder, what the hell is she doing? Why is she just standing there behind the tent? She knows I'm here. I'm obviously here. The fire's going. So at this point, he called out to her. He said, "May, is that you?" And there was no response. He sat there for a few seconds thinking, okay, this has to be her. She's just messing with me. So he called out again. He said, "May, what are you doing? Come on, get in the tent. The bugs are going to eat you alive." And again, there was no response. At this point, Kenny was getting a little bit frustrated. He thought for sure this was May. She's just messing with him. But at the same time, he was a little bit annoyed because she was not responding to him. So again, he called out to her. He said, May, what are you doing? And as soon as he said that, he heard where those footsteps had stopped behind him. Also, he heard footsteps start to run circles around the front of the camp. As he's listening to this, he's wondering, what the hell is she doing? So he again yells out to her. He yells, May, what are you doing? And there's again no response whatsoever. So he reaches into his backpack, he grabs a flashlight, makes his way to the front of the tent, starts to unzip it. And as soon as he started to move the zipper, also where those footsteps had stopped, those footsteps started running deeper into the woods. At this point, he's thinking that she's just playing a game with him. She must want him to chase her. So he quickly unzips the rest of the tent, steps out, stands up, he turns on his flashlight, starts shining it into the trees, and he cannot see her anywhere. So he makes his way past the fire right up towards where the thicker bush starts, shining his light in. He's looking around, and he cannot hear her running anymore. He can't see her. So he yells out to her. He yells, May, this isn't funny. Get back here. I'm not playing this game with you. Come on. You're wasting time. And again, though, there was just no response. So Kenny slowly makes his way into the bush. He starts going 10, 20, 30 yards in the entire time with his flashlight up, looking into the woods, and still no sign of her whatsoever. Kenny was now starting to get really annoyed. She was obviously messing with him. She wanted to play a game, but she was wasting time, and he was just not in the mood to go running through the woods in the dark. So he turned around, he made his way back to camp, went inside the tent. Once he was in the tent, he grabbed his phone out of his pack. He figured, you know what, I'm just going to text her. I'm going to say, okay, enough with this, just come to the tent. So he sent her a quick text. He waited a couple of minutes and there was no reply. At this point, he could hear those footsteps starting to make their way closer back to camp. And he decided to, you know what, enough with the text, enough with calling out. He opened up his phone and he actually ended up calling her. The phone only rang twice before somebody answered on the other end, except the voice that answered was not May's. It was actually May's father. When Kenny heard May's dad's voice, he basically completely froze. He was a little bit confused why May's dad was answering the phone because he had never answered her cell phone before. When all of a sudden her dad started to speak, and all he said was, I'm sorry, Kenny, May will not be joining you tonight. I caught her sneaking out. Please do not call again. And then he hung up the phone. Kenny sat there just completely confused, completely baffled, wondering how she got caught. He was feeling a little bummed that she was not going to be joining him that night. But then all of a sudden, he remembered those footsteps. At this point, Kenny felt his heart rate starting to pick up because those footsteps that he had heard were definitely not animal footprints. It was definitely not from a coyote. It was not from a bear. It was definitely bipedal. It was on 2 feet. And he was absolutely terrified. He had no idea who was out in the woods with him. And he just basically sat in the tent, just staring out the flap towards the fire. Kenny sat there for a couple of seconds, trying to figure out what he was going to do, running different thoughts through his head. Like, was this maybe one of his parents? Was it a buddy? Did one of their friends find out and they're just messing with them? But at the same time, he had other thoughts running through his head, like, what if this is some type of crazy person? What if this person followed us into the woods one day, found our camp, and they were waiting for us to come back? So he was trying to figure out what he was going to do next, when all of a sudden he heard May's voice from across the fire over into the woods where those footsteps had run, and her voice just said, Kenny, come here. I'm over here. When he heard this voice, his blood ran cold because he knew May's dad very well, and May's dad would not tell him that she was stuck in her room, that she had got caught sneaking out, and that she wouldn't be joining him if it was not true. He would not lie, no matter how mad he was at him. He would not lie to him. So now Kenny's trying to figure out who the hell this is and why the hell do they sound like my girlfriend. As he's sitting there processing everything in his head, he starts to realize that the area is completely silent. There's no more sounds of bugs, there's no more sounds of anything at all. And then he hears those footsteps start to move even closer. And again, he hears May's voice call out to him. The exact same thing as before, just, Kenny, I'm over here, come here. And he felt his heart rate again start to pick up even more. He was completely frozen in fear. He sat there staring out the tent flap, really not knowing what to do. And every footstep that came closer and closer towards the camp, he felt his anxiety and his fear start to raise even more. Now, he was completely unarmed and he knew he really had nothing to protect himself. He had a backpack with some snacks and some drinks, and that was pretty much about it. Like, if whatever this thing was or whoever this was came into camp, his only type of defense would be to grab this backpack and pretty much throw it at it. It was completely useless. And he knew that he was in a very dangerous situation right now, that there was somebody or something moving towards camp, and he was completely unarmed. After a few more seconds of hearing those footsteps come closer and closer and hearing May's voice call out again and again, all of a sudden, across the fire up along the bush line, he starts to catch a little bit of movement. Once he sees this movement, he kind of instinctively kind of lean forward, looking further out that flap, trying to get a little bit of a better look at whatever this was, when all of a sudden from behind this one big pine tree, this real small, emaciated, but super tall humanoid-like creature kind of came creeping around the tree, looking directly at him. He got a pretty good look at this thing's face. It had dark, sunken-in eyes. It had a massive mouth. And this thing was looking directly at him. Kenny just sat there completely frozen in fear, basically eyes locked right on this thing, when all of a sudden this thing opened its mouth and it was May's voice coming out of it. Upon seeing this, it was like it broke that trance from Kenny. Kenny was no longer basically paralyzed with fear. As soon as he saw that, it gave him that oomph, that adrenaline kick to actually get his butt moving and kick himself into gear. And he found himself very quickly scurrying out of the tent. He stood up, he turned, and he just started blind sprinting through the woods in the dark. He had no flashlight on him, no nothing. He was just running through the trees in the pitch black. Kenny sprinted through the trees, constantly thinking that this thing was going to get up behind him, and he could actually hear this thing running behind him. He could hear it almost, it sounded like it was climbing up on trees, jumping from one tree to another, and he kept hearing this thing calling his name. The entire time, Kenny was figuring this is the end for him. He figured this is how I'm going to die. Whatever this thing is, it's going to get me, and I'm going to be gone. But this thing never got really more than about 20 yards from him. It was like almost like it was staying within that 20-yard gap behind him, and it never really closed in on him. He never really gained distance on this thing. And eventually, as he ran through the trees, slowly his house lights started to come into view. As soon as he started to see his house lights, then he noticed that the sound of this creature behind him sounded like it was starting to get further and further behind him. As soon as he broke the bush line, he basically just sprinted right up to his house and he started banging on the door. After banging on the door for a few seconds, his dad answered the door and was completely confused why Kenny is standing outside, why his son is drenched in sweat, and why he looks absolutely terrified. And Kenny was forced to tell his dad the story. He was forced to tell him that he snuck out of the house to go meet up with May, told him exactly what had happened, and his father did not really believe him. And he ended up telling Kenny just to go to his room and they would deal with it in the morning. The next morning over breakfast, again, they went over what had happened. And now Kenny's dad was starting to believe parts of his story. He did not really believe this weird, emaciated, pale humanoid creature, but he did believe him that there was somebody or something out of the woods because his son was obviously shaken up. So Kenny's dad ended up calling over to May's dad, told him what Kenny had told him, and it actually ended up kind of working out for Kenny and for May because their parents figured, you know what, our kids are going to see each other anyway. They're sneaking out, they're meeting in the woods. It's dangerous out of the woods. There's predators, there's bears, there's coyotes, and now there's some person out on the property as well. You know what? Let's put our differences aside for our kids. Let's lift these rules. Let's let them see each other whenever they want so they do not need to feel the urge to go sneak out into the woods to go see each other. So it did end up working out to their advantage. However, Kenny and May, they kind of lost a little bit of their love for walking through the bush, going on their hikes, because May truly did believe Kenny's story. Even to this day, all these years later, Kenny and May, they've since gotten married, they've had a couple of kids, and Kenny still, every time he's out in the woods, especially at dark, he does feel incredibly uneasy. So the two of them, they don't do a lot of camping anymore. They still do hikes. They do take their children on hikes, but it's only in well-populated parks and it's only during the day. Lynn had a little bit of a different childhood growing up. Her father was a Green Beret, he served in Vietnam, and for most of her childhood, she bounced around all of the continental US, staying at different military bases. And her upbringing, even though she was an Army kid, was a little bit different than most military children because her dad was a Green Beret. He was very highly trained in outdoor survival, and he wanted to teach those skills to Lynn. So whenever he would be home, he would take Lynn and his wife, they'd venture off into the bush, and he would teach Lynn bushcraft, teach her how to make things, how to fend for herself, forage for food on the land, how to hunt and trap. And he started doing this with her when she was about 5 years old. Lynn, all through her childhood, that was just normal. No matter where they went, where they were staying in the US, every weekend that her father was home, they'd be out in the bush, he'd be teaching her lessons. As she got into her teen years, Lynn started branching off a little bit from her parents. She started going off on these adventures by herself. She would see how long she could stay out in the woods before she felt uneasy, before she started to feel the effects of it, just to see how long she could last. When she was in her 20s, though, Lynn, she was now working. She had a full-time job that paid pretty well. She decided she wanted to change this up. She wanted to change up these adventures that she would have. And she purchased an older van. She renovated the entire inside of it to be basically a camper on wheels, very similar to those vans that people that live van lives have today. Those vans are completely decked out with everything you can need, with a bed, with a stove. Basically, you're able to live inside of these vans. And Lynn, she was kind of one of the originators of this because this was back in the early 80s. And camping in a van, having a van decked out like she did, was not the norm. It was a little bit unheard of. Yeah, there were people that did have similar vans, but it was nowhere near the scope that it is today. Lynn, at this point of her life, she was 25 years old and she just moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. She spent a couple of years in North Carolina growing up, and out of everywhere in the States that she had lived, she really, really loved North Carolina. It was the state that felt most like home. So that's why she ended up moving to Charlotte. And then every single weekend that she had off from work, she was venturing off in her van, going to different parts of North Carolina, seeing the scenery. But there was one specific place that really drew her in. And that was up near the Blue Ridge Mountains, which are part of the Appalachian Mountain Range. It was a place that she felt incredibly at home. It was a place that she can escape from people. She could be off on her own. She could practice her bushcraft, and she could just have a weekend of peace. And in the summer of 1988, she decided she was going to take 2 weeks off from work, and she was going to spend that entire time venturing all along the Blue Ridge Mountains. There were a ton of places that she wanted to check out, lots of places she had never been. So she was really looking forward to that trip. Now, she had never done a long trip like this before. It was typically weekends, maybe 3, 4, 5 days here or there, but never a full 2 weeks. But for her, that would be nothing just because of the amount of experience she had out in the woods. She did tell her parents her plan, and her father immediately told her, "You have to bring protection. Bring a firearm with you." Lynn, she reassured her father that she would be bringing her pistol, and not to worry that he had taught her well growing up, and she was easily able to defend herself in any situation that she would come across. Her father, though, was a little bit hesitant just because he knows how dangerous it could be for a woman to be out on her own, out in the woods. So he was a little bit concerned for her, and he really did stress that fact to her. And when the day came, it was a Friday. As soon as she got off work, she headed to the grocery store. She got some groceries. She went home. She loaded up her van. Then she made the hour-and-a-half drive to where she had planned to camp. As she got a little bit closer to this area, she had to pull off of the highway, go down this long gravel road. She traveled down it for about 7 or 8 miles when she came to a spot where the road kind of forked off to one side, and the fork that ran off to the left, that was not a gravel road. It was basically this trail leading into the bush. She had heard about this trail, she had seen maps of it, and it led up to a small valley. There's a river going through the middle of it, and she figured that she could get pretty far down this trail with her van and that she would be far enough away from people that she wouldn't have to worry about being bugged. So when she got to this trail, she turned her van onto it. She drove for about a mile and a half. Once she got to this one spot, it was really rocky. There were trees down across the trail. She knew she could not go any further, so she slowed the van down. She came to a complete stop. Then she sat there just staring out the windshield for a couple of seconds. She was feeling a little depressed and a little let down because she could not get to where she had planned to go. So she started to debate what she should do next. Should she turn around, head back the way she came, or should she camp right where she stopped? But then she happened to look out the windshield to the right, and she could see through the trees there was actually a fair-sized clearing, and there was a trail going through the trees up to this clearing. She looked at it and she figured, you know what? I think my van can make it in there. It sits high enough. I've got good tires. I should easily be able to get into that clearing. So she put the van in reverse. She backed up. She put it back in drive. She cranked the wheel, started heading through that little trail. And even though she was going pretty slow, this trail was incredibly rough. She could feel the van rocking side to side. She could hear stuff falling behind her. But very slowly, she did manage to make it into that clearing. Once she was in the clearing, she pulled her van over to the one bush line. She got out. She started surveying the area. And she ended up coming to the conclusion that, you know what, this area is pretty nice. It's not where I planned on going, but, this will do. I could definitely stay here for a couple of nights. And then she started setting up her camp. She pulled everything out of the van that she needed outside. She gathered firewood. And about a half hour later, all of a sudden coming down that trail that she had drove in on, she could hear a vehicle coming down it. Lynn kind of stopped for a second, started looking in the direction of the sound of this vehicle, thinking that, this is pretty strange. I'm pretty far away from anybody. There really should not be anybody coming down this trail. And she almost immediately just got this gut feeling that something wasn't right. So she made her way up to her van. She opened up the passenger door. She grabbed her pistol from on the passenger seat. She put it in her holster on her hip. Then she just walked to the back of the van, stood there, looking down that small trail that she just drove into. Sure enough, about a minute later, a truck comes driving down the road, and it stops right at the entrance of that small trail. She could clearly see that there were two men inside this vehicle, and both of them were staring directly at her. This made her feel incredibly uneasy, so she stood there staring at them, and all she did is she just put her hand down on her pistol. And both of these guys almost immediately backed the truck up, they turned, and they started driving directly towards her. Lynn at this point was actually incredibly nervous because she's alone out in the wilderness. Nobody knows exactly where she is. And now there's two strange men that are driving towards her when they can clearly tell that she's armed. She has her hand on her pistol, and she watched as this truck got closer and closer towards her. She could feel her heart rate start to race. She was no longer just a little uneasy. She was almost in a full-on panic, but she was trying very hard to at least appear to be remaining calm, just so that these guys would not know that she was nervous. A couple moments later, the truck pulled right up beside her. The passenger window came down. Both men turned, looked right at her, and then the passenger said, "It ain't safe for a woman to be out here alone." Lynn, upon hearing that, it was almost like she took it as a threat, because when this man said those words, she felt this stroke of fear go through her entire body. She had her hand still on her pistol. She looked this guy right in the eye, and she said, "I think I'm going to be okay," and she glanced down at her sidearm. The guy's eyes, too, as she did that, looked down directly at her pistol. And then he said something that really shook her. He just said, "Well, good luck, sweetheart." Then the window went up and the truck started driving into the clearing. It did a big 180, headed back the way it came. And Lynn stood there watching the truck drive away. And as soon as it was no longer in sight, she almost immediately dropped down to her knees and began crying. She was incredibly shaken up. She no longer felt safe, and she knew that she had to leave this area. She had this gut feeling that these two men were going to come back, and she wanted to be long gone before they did. So she very quickly packed everything into the van. She turned around. She made her way back down that small trail, down the main trail, back up to that big gravel road. She ended up driving for about 10 miles down this gravel road when she came to another trail that led off the left side of the road up into the bush. She figured that she had not seen these guys while driving out of that first trail or driving down that gravel road. So she figured she would go down this trail and she would probably not have to worry about them again. So she drove down this trail for about 3 miles. She just pulled off onto the side of it. It opened up into a bit of a clearing right up along this one ridge. So she parked her van. She ended up pulling out just basically what she needed for the night because now it was actually full on dark outside. So she pulled her little barbecue out. She pulled out a little folding table, a little folding chair. She ended up making some food. And then as soon as she was done eating, she ended up calling it a night. She headed into her van to go to sleep. A couple of hours later, she was abruptly woken up by the sound of what sounded like her table being flipped over, her barbecue being knocked over. And her first thought was that it was these men. These men had followed her back to this spot. So she immediately reached beside her. She grabbed her pistol. She's lying in the bed, pistol aimed towards the side door of this van. And she just sat there listening. She could hear whatever or whoever this was outside, rummaging through her barbecue, moving all of her stuff around. And then it sounded like this person or whoever this was started walking circles around the van. At this point, all she ended up doing is she yelled out, "I'm armed," and almost immediately all that noise outside completely stopped. Lynn lay there for the entire rest of the night until the sun came up with her pistol ready pointed towards the door. Once the sun had come out, she got up, she made her way to the side door of her van. She very slowly opened it up with her pistol in her other hand. She looked outside and she could see that, yeah, somebody or something definitely did basically destroy her barbecue. It was lying in pieces. It was scattered all around the area around the van. Her table was bent in half. Her chair was completely busted. And at this point, she was not really feeling afraid. She was actually feeling pretty pissed off because she figured it was those men, and those men were just effing with her. And it put her into this almost fit of rage. She decided at that moment that she was not going to leave. She was going to stay and she was going to confront these guys if they came back that night. So throughout the day, she spent a lot of time doing her bushcraft. She set up a lean-to out of an A-frame. She built a new chair out of branches from a tree. Once evening came, she ate some food, and then instead of going into the van, she ended up going to her lean-to. Now, when she built this lean-to, it was not using a tarp, it was not out of the open. It was right up inside the bushes. She had used a lot of foliage, a lot of branches, pine boughs, stuff like that to cover up over top of it. So it was really camouflaged very well. And she figured if she was inside this lean-to, she could see all the way across the clearing. She could see her van, and she'd be able to tell when these guys came back. As the night carried on, though, she found that occasionally she would start to doze off. She'd feel herself starting to doze off. She would take a deep breath. She would sit up, try to regain her alertness, and focus on what she was doing. However, as the night carried on, those brief dozing off periods, they happened more frequently, they lasted longer, and at one point she fell completely asleep. Laying there on the ground of her lean-to, completely unconscious in a deep sleep, all of a sudden she's abruptly woken up by the sound of a large stick breaking somewhere in the woods behind her. She immediately sat up, she got her pistol up, and she felt her heart rate start to race again. She focused in the direction that noise came from, and occasionally she could hear what sounded like footsteps through the trees, except it didn't sound like whoever this was coming towards her. It sounded like they were heading towards her van. At this point, she is figuring that it's these guys. They must have parked on the main road. They must have walked in a ways, came into this clearing. They're trying to sneak up on my van. And she started running through all these different scenarios in her head on how she would handle this situation. She sat listening for about a half an hour when all of a sudden she could no longer hear those footfalls anymore. It had traveled too far away from her. And at this point, she was debating, should she stay in the lean-to, wait for whoever this is to come out, go up to her van? Should she try sneaking up on them? But at the same time, she was thinking, if it is these men, there's two of them. I'm out here all by myself. Nobody knows where I am. I'm just going to stay inside the lean-to. I'm safe here. Whoever this was, they were moving away from me. If they come, I do have my pistol. I just want to see who this is, just so I know what the hell is going on. A few moments later, in the direction of her van, she notices this dark figure coming out of the bush. She cannot really make anything out of this person or this thing because it was way too dark. All she could see was this dark silhouette emerging from the trees. This silhouette started moving towards her van, and it moved a little weird. It did not move like a normal person. It wasn't a typical person's walk. It was like this person had some type of issue walking. They were kind of moving all weird. They were hunched over. And that's when she realized that this person had really weird arms. The arms were incredibly long, but she figured that's probably just because of the way they're hunched over. And she watched this person, this figure, circle her van a few times when all of a sudden it stopped and it stood completely motionless. This person did not move for almost 5 minutes when all of a sudden it turned and started walking across the clearing almost directly in front of her. Now, it was pretty dark outside. The moon was blocked by the clouds. There was not a lot of ambient light, but she could make out this figure, this silhouette moving in front of her, and something about it just did not make sense. She could clearly see that whoever this was incredibly skinny. They had very skinny legs, long, skinny arms. But the main part of the body of this person was also incredibly thin. It was like whoever this was had not eaten in an incredibly long time. Her first thought was that, maybe it was a lost hiker. It was somebody that got lost out in the woods, weren't able to feed themselves. But at the same time, she's figuring, well, if that was the case, why did they not try to get into the van? Why did they just circle it a few times and then stand completely still and then walk away from it? Like, that would be a tall tale sign that there's somebody out here that could help them. At that point, she actually did start to feel that she was in danger because this could not be a person. It just did not make sense, but she had no idea what she was dealing with. She watched this figure disappear off into the bush. And then she decided what she was going to do next. She tried to figure out what to do. Should she make a break for her van, try to get out of there? Should she stay completely silent inside of her lean-to and hope that whoever or whatever this was doesn't find her? She sat there for about 20 minutes running through those thoughts in her head, listening the entire time for any sounds coming towards her, any sounds off in the bush, and she did not hear anything. So at this point, she's thinking that whoever or whatever this was is now long gone. She decides she is going to make a break for her van. So she takes a deep breath, she gets up with her pistol in her hand, and then she begins to sprint at about 150 yards to the van. As soon as she started running across this clearing, she hears in the woods, back where that creature went into the bush, this incredibly loud, almost earth-shattering scream. It was incredibly high-pitched. It actually hurt her ear. As she's running, she had to put her hand up against her ear. She starts screaming herself. She turns her head, she looks behind her, and that's when she sees this thing emerge from the bushes. This thing was running on all fours, almost like a person crawling, but this was of almost like a full-on sprint. This thing was gaining on her really fast. She screamed again. She looked in front of her. She sprinted as fast as she could towards the van. When she got about 10 yards from the van, she could hear all hell breaking loose behind her. She could hear the rocks, she could hear the grass being torn up, and she knew this thing was close. So out of almost an act of desperation, with her pistol, she swings it behind her as she's running. She fires off a couple of shots towards this thing, and when she fired one of those shots, she heard this thing let out this loud squeal, and then she could hear it basically wipe out on the ground behind her. She did not want to turn around. She was so close to the van. So she just continued running to the van. She got to the van. She opened the door. She jumped in. She immediately hit the lock. She started the van up when all of a sudden that creature that she had shot at was standing directly in front of the van. This is when she got a real good look at this thing. This thing was about 6 feet tall. It had pale, grayish white skin. It was incredibly emaciated. She could see its ribs. She could see all of the bones in this thing's body. And what stood out to her the most was the fact this thing had no hair on its head. Its eyes were black and sunken in, and where its lips should be, they were just completely gone. And she could see this thing's teeth incredibly clearly in the headlights. It had really nasty, broken looking teeth that had these sharp, jagged edges. And she did not know what to do. She didn't know if she should take her pistol, fire through the windshield at this thing, if she should try running this thing down. She basically sat there frozen in fear, looking at this creature. When all of a sudden this creature started moving towards the front of her van a little bit more. And it was like as soon as this thing was right up against the front of the van, it was like it snapped her out of this daze, out of this stupor that she was in. She immediately put the van into drive. She floored the gas, and she ended up actually plowing into this creature, hit it with the front passenger side of the van, basically sent this thing falling over beside the van. And she used that moment, that opportunity to whip her van around to try heading back to the main trail. As she turned her van around, though, her headlights again illuminated this creature, and this thing was struggling to get up. As she drove past it, she just kept having this thought that this thing's going to chase after her. And sure enough, this thing did chase after her. She ended up having to put her foot down on the gas and floor it as fast as she could. Her van was bouncing around. She could hear everything in the back falling to the floor, but she did not care. She kept looking in her driver's side mirror, and she could see in the taillights illumination behind her, this creature actually gaining on her as she was driving. And at this point, she was driving about 35 miles an hour, and this thing was still gaining on her. So she put her foot to the floor even more. And at this point, she didn't care if she busted her van. All she wanted to do was just get away from this thing. After a couple of moments, though, she did manage to pull away from it, and she made her way back up to that main highway. When she got to the main highway, she ended up just driving all the way home. Over the next couple of days, she just replayed those events over and over, and she was trying to decide if she should tell anybody. She didn't know if she should tell the authorities. She didn't even know if she should tell her own dad. But eventually she did open up to her father, and her father just told her that, there are things out there that people don't know about, things that some people cannot talk about. I'm glad you're safe, but never go back there again. Don't go there. Even if you have a bunch of people, just stay away from that area. In the years that followed, Lynn still does van camping, but she tends to stay closer to people. She no longer goes way off into the bush by herself. And one thing that's really stuck with her through all of this was not even so much the experience itself, but the fact that her father, who was a former Green Beret, told her that there's things out there that people are not allowed to talk about. So that really makes her wonder every time she's out in the woods, what could be hiding or lurking deep within them, because she knows that there's something out there that people do not know about. Sean grew up on the outskirts of Toronto, Ontario, which is the largest city in Canada, but he was by far the furthest thing from a city kid. His parents, they owned a fair-sized cabin located about 3.5 hours north of Toronto, and from the time he was about 4 years old, every single weekend, no matter what the time of year, his family, they were going out to this cabin. And when they were out there, Sean would spend all of his time doing all types of motorsports. He was a bit of a motorhead from the time he was about 4 or 5 years old. And anything with a motor, Sean was addicted to it from a very early age. Sean would also spend a lot of time fishing out on this lake. This lake was very secluded. There was only about 4 or 5 other cabins all around this lake. So when they would go out to their cabin, they were basically cut off from society. The nearest neighbor was probably about a 20-minute walk through the bush. And they would very rarely even ever see any of them. They might run into them on the lake, but when they would be out on the road, they would basically be on their own. And Sean, again, from a very young age, he would wander around the bush out at this cabin. He would wander off far from the cabin by himself. He'd walk down the roads, and it was not uncommon for him just to hop on his bike, go down the gravel road, and for his parents not to see him for several hours. As Sean got older, his love for the outdoors just continued to grow. And when he was about 15 years old, it was not uncommon when his family would go out to the lake for Sean just to disappear all day, all night, off into the woods by himself. He would go camping several miles from his cabin completely solo. So to say that Sean was not an experienced outdoorsman would be further from the truth. This kid grew up in the bush, even though he grew up in the city. He was completely at home out in this area. He knew every inch of the area surrounding the lake where his parents' cabin was, like most people know the back of their hands. Once Sean had his driver's license and he was a senior in high school, there were several times where his family were not going out to the cabin, but his parents were completely cool with Sean and a buddy driving that 3.5 hours out to the lake because his parents knew that he knew how to get the cabin up and running for a weekend. He knew how to get the pump started, and they had no concerns at all with his abilities out at the cabin. Once Sean graduated high school, though, he was not able to get out as much as he liked. He started going to college in Toronto, and that really took up a lot of his time. He found on the weekends he was stuck either working or studying. And if he wasn't working or studying, more times than not, he would be at a college party. He would be out hanging out with friends. And he just did not get out to the lake as much as he would like. He would still go out a couple of times a year, but it was nowhere near the amount of time he would spend out there that he spent growing up. But early into his last year of college, Sean met a girl named Annie, and the two of them, they very quickly hit it off. They enjoyed a lot of the same things, but when it came to the outdoors, these two, they were polar opposites. Sean grew up out of the bush. He grew up going to the cabin. And Annie, she was a city girl. She basically never left Toronto, and her experience with the great outdoors was pretty much just a park in Toronto or going to the zoo. She basically never went out of the city limits of Toronto, even as a kid. So these two, even though they had a lot of similarities, they were very different. But one thing that the two of them did share in common was their willingness to try different things with each other. So come February of that year, right as they were about to have their spring break, they were talking about what they could do for spring break. And Sean came up with this awesome idea that he could take Annie out to his parents' cabin. They could go out there for the entire week. They could go snowmobiling. They could do some ice fishing. He could show her around nature. And Annie actually very quickly jumped at this chance. She was really looking forward to going out to this cabin. And she ended up telling her friend Claire that her and Sean were going to go out to Sean's parents' cabin. And her friend Claire, who was also a city girl, she got really excited for Annie and she started to get a little bit jealous. And she asked Annie if Sean would be okay if her and her boyfriend Michael came out that week as well. When Annie asked Sean, Sean was a little bit upset. He was really looking forward to just being the two of them. And he did not know Claire's boyfriend Michael. He knew Claire, but he had never met her boyfriend. But at the same time, he was thinking, you know what? How bad could this be? There's 4 of us going out. That means less work for me to do. I could share some of the work with this Michael guy. This will probably still be a pretty good trip. I'm going to get my girlfriend out to the cabin. I'm going to go snowmobiling. I haven't done that in ages. I'm going to get to do some ice fishing. You know what? This is going to be fine. As the time came for them to head out to their cabin, the 4 of them, they started making their plans. They made a list of all the gear that they were going to bring out, a list of all their food. Then once spring break started, that final day of college, right before spring break, they loaded up Sean's truck with everything they would need, and they made that 3.5 hour drive out to the parents' cabin. Fairly early into the drive, it became very apparent to Sean that him and Michael were complete opposites, and they were going to clash. Michael kept asking Sean questions over and over and over, and the type of questions he kept asking him really were starting to annoy Sean. Sean was getting very annoyed with this constant questioning, and by the time they got to the cabin a few hours later, Sean was already just basically willing to say, you know what, I'm just going to turn this truck around and head back home. Like, he was already that close to just giving up on this week out at the lake. But once they got to that driveway, Sean became even more annoyed. It was full on dark at this point, and Sean was not able to get his truck up the long 200-meter drive up to the cabin because of the vast amount of snow. It was not just the snow that was the problem. It was the fact that where the cabin was up on the top of this hill that overlooked down towards the lake. And that driveway was incredibly snow covered. He did not have the proper tires to drive his truck up. He did not have the power in his truck. So that meant they were going to have to park on the road, carry everything 200 meters up this hill to the cabin. So Sean pulled the truck over to the side. And then because they had so much stuff with them, they were not going to be able to carry everything in just one trip. So they made a plan that the first trip, all four of them would carry as much as they could. They'd head up to the cabin. Sean would get the power going. He would get the electric heaters going. He would get a fire going in the wood stove. And then him and Michael would head back down to the truck and bring more stuff up. And they would continue to do that until everything was up in the cabin. And that's exactly what they did. But on the last trip down to the truck to get the last of the stuff, they were about halfway down, so about 100 meters from the cabin, another 100 meters down to the truck. All of a sudden, the nighttime air was just filled with the sounds of wolves howling. Almost immediately, once these wolves started howling, Michael, he just completely froze in fear. He just stood there, holding his flashlight up, looking side to side into the bush. And Sean can see that Michael was terrified. He could tell just by the look on his face. So he tried to reassure him that this was normal, everything was okay. But Michael actually refused to move. He just would not take a step forward. He would not walk back up to the cabin by himself. And Sean, at this point, was actually very annoyed with Michael. He was like, "Hey, dude, it's fine. It's just wolves. They'll leave us alone. I come across them all the time out here. Don't worry, we're fine. Let's just get the last of the stuff, get back up to the cabin to the girls." But Michael just would not budge. So Sean had to walk Michael all the way back up to the cabin. He left him at the cabin. Then he made that 200-yard walk down to his truck, grabbed the last of the stuff, and now he was like completely bundled up. He was carrying way too much stuff. It was enough stuff for two people to carry. But he really did not have any other choice. He really did not want to make one of the girls walk this walk and walk back uphill carrying stuff. So he just basically sucked it up and he just hauled through it. He ended up getting everything up to the cabin. Once he was in the cabin, he basically had a conversation with Michael telling him, "Dude, look, everything's okay. Like, you need to calm down. You're safe out here. I've been out here since I was a kid. You're okay." And even though Michael was shaken by those wolves, he did listen to Sean, and very slowly over the next couple of hours, he started to loosen up a bit. He started going outside onto the deck to have a cigarette by himself, and he was starting to feel more at ease. Later that night, it was now the early morning hours. All four of them, they were going to be heading off to bed. And Sean, he had to go restock the wood stove one last time for the night. Once he got to where the wood stove was, he went to reach down to grab some wood, and he discovered that they had already burned all their wood. They would have to go outside to get more. Michael, at this point, actually volunteered to go outside to get wood, and it kind of shocked Sean a little bit. He kind of looked at Michael and was like, "Really? You're okay to do that?" And Michael's like, "Yeah, you know what? I'm feeling a lot better now. The woodshed's not far away. I got this, bud. I'll go get the wood." At this point, Sean's like, "You know what? Maybe this guy's not that bad. Maybe I just needed to get to know him a little bit better." And he watched Michael make his way out the side door. He watched him step down the stairs. And Sean was actually starting to feel a little hopeful for the next day when they were going to be going snowmobiling. However, that hopefulness was abruptly shattered when all of a sudden he could hear from outside towards the woodshed Michael screaming at the top of his lungs. And this was not just a normal scream. Like, this was a blood-curdling, scared to death, terrified type scream. Sean just immediately sprung into action. He ran to the door. He ran outside. He did not even put his boots on. He was running through snow knee deep. He gets over to where Michael was, and Michael's just completely pale as a ghost. Sean ended up reaching out. He put his hand on Michael's shoulder, and he asked him what was wrong. And Michael just blurted out. He said, "I just saw a werewolf." Sean kind of looked at Michael like, "What the hell are you talking about? You just saw a werewolf?" And he's like, "What?" And Michael holds his flashlight up. He's shining it into the bush. And he's like, "I just saw a werewolf. There's a werewolf in the bushes. It was looking at me. I just saw a werewolf." Sean started to laugh. He kind of looked at Michael, laughing. He's like, "Dude, what the hell are you talking about? You saw a werewolf?" He's like, "Man, werewolves don't exist." He's like, "You probably saw a coyote. You probably saw one of the wolves." And Michael's like, "No, I saw a werewolf. This was a werewolf. This was not a dog. This was not a coyote. This was not a wolf. This was a werewolf." And Sean again's like, "Dude, these do not exist. What are you going on about?" He's like, "I told you, you probably just saw a wolf." And Sean, as much as he tried to convince Michael, Michael just kept on repeating that he saw a werewolf. So Sean's thinking, great, not only is this guy useless, but he's also crazy, and he did not know what to do. So he just took a step past Michael. He reached down, he grabbed some wood out of the woodshed, holding it in his hands. He looks at Michael and says, "Come on, guy, get in the cabin before your werewolf gets you." And as the two of them turn to head back up to the cabin, all of a sudden they heard this real deep guttural howl. It was incredibly loud. It was super deep, coming from the direction that Michael had claimed to see this werewolf. Sean immediately stopped walking. Michael picked up on the fact that Sean was no longer beside him. He stopped as well, turned, looks at Sean, and says, "What the hell was that?" And Sean was completely baffled. He knew what wolves sounded like. He knew what coyotes sounded like. And this sounded a lot different. It just had a massive lung capacity to it. And he looked at Michael and said, "I don't know. That's not normal. Let's get inside now." The two of them, they actually ended up running back up to the cabin. They went inside. And both girls were actually standing by the door because they had heard Michael screaming before. And they were asking what was going on and what was wrong. Michael told both the girls that he had seen this werewolf, and they too had heard the same howl that the guys had heard. And Sean's basically stuck in the middle, trying to piece together what had just happened, what this howl was, what Michael could have seen. And everybody was looking to him for answers, and he did not have any answers for them. The best he could come up with was that it was just a wolf, and that what Michael had seen was probably a wolf standing up against a tree. But Michael kept on denying that. He kept saying that, no, he saw a werewolf, that this was not a normal wolf. But Sean was not buying into it. Even the girls thought Michael was kind of losing it a little bit. And Michael was just standing there, just pleading with them, saying, "We have to go. Let's just go. Let's just leave everything. Let's go to the truck. I don't want to be here. Can we please go?" And all the others were like, "We can't go right now. It's super late at night. We're all super tired. It's a long drive back. Like, just go to bed. We'll deal with this in the morning." So the four of them, they did end up going to bed. But as Sean was laying there in bed, he just kept thinking about that howl over and over. Just how weird it sounded, how it sounded a lot like a wolf, but a lot different, and just had that real strong lung capacity to it. And over the next little bit, Sean felt the temperature in the cabin starting to drop. The electric heaters were just not keeping up with the cold outside. And he knew he was going to have to go outside and get more firewood, because when they ran up to the cabin, he actually dropped all the wood on the ground. And he was debating if he really should. Even though, he grew up out at this cabin, he knew the entire area like the back of his hand. That howl, it was just not sitting well with him. But he ended up telling himself, "You know what? You're just being a wuss. You're just shooken up. You spent countless nights out of the bush out here by yourself before. There's nothing out there to be afraid of. Just go get the firewood." So he slowly sat up. He made his way to the back door. He put his boots on. Then he took a couple of steps down the 5 steps that led down to the ground. And when he was on about the 3rd step, all of a sudden he just felt this undeniable feeling of dread. It almost stopped him right in his tracks. He had this feeling like if he took one more step, something bad was going to happen and that he should just not go any further forward. He should just head back inside. And just getting that feeling really shook him because he had never experienced anything like that before. So as soon as that feeling struck, he just immediately kind of froze, started looking around. He reached into his pocket. He did not have a flashlight, but there was a little bit of light from a light on the side of the cabin. And so he was looking towards the bush line, scanning it, looking for anything that might be causing this feeling. Maybe there's the wolves that were howling earlier. Maybe they're close up to the cabin now. Maybe that's why he's feeling it. But as he's looking towards the tree line, all of a sudden, out of the corner of his eye, up to his right, he sees this little bit of steam kind of come down. And out of the corner of his eye, what it looked like was this steam when you exhale when you're out in the cold. And he felt this like sinking feeling just go through his entire body because he knew that the only thing up to his right was the overhang of the roof of the cabin, and it was nowhere near where the wood stove was. So, reluctantly and just completely dreading what he might see, he slowly turns his head up to this right, and he just almost immediately felt like he was going to have a heart attack because he could see up on the roof this dark silhouette kind of crest up against the moonlight. He could not make any details out, but he could see that there is clearly something on the roof. So he's standing there looking up at this thing when all of a sudden this thing turns, looks down directly at him. And that's when he got a good look at this thing. This thing was absolutely massive. It was about 7.5, 8 feet tall. It had the head of a wolf that looked a lot like a German Shepherd. It had the pointy ears. It had the long snout. It was completely covered in hair. And what he noticed was that it looked like it actually had long arms. He could see what looked like one long arm kind of grabbing onto the side of the eaves trough of the cabin, kind of holding itself, stopping it from sliding off the roof. And when this thing was looking at him, he could see that its eyes glowed this like glowing ambery color without the light really even reflecting on it. It was like these eyes just emitted that color. As he's standing there staring up at this thing, everything that had happened before was shooting through his mind like at a mile a minute. And he remembered what Michael said about seeing a werewolf. And Sean, seeing this dogman creature, this werewolf looking down at him, replaying that thought in his head about Michael, he was completely terrified. He could not move. And then it opened up its mouth, exposing its long, razor-sharp teeth. And Sean was just staring up at it, just in utter disbelief, when all of a sudden this thing let out this low, deep, guttural snarl type growl. It pulled its lips even further back. And at that point, it kind of snapped Sean out of this trance. He started slowly backing up towards the door, not taking his eyes off this creature on the roof. And as soon as his back hit up against the door, he swung around, he grabbed the doorknob, pushed it open, and he actually ended up falling into the cabin. He quickly scurried up, grabbed the door, slammed it shut, locked it, ran back through these two big glass sliding doors. He closed those, he latched them locked, grabbed the blinds, slid them over the window. Then he took a couple of steps back, and at this point, he was almost hyperventilating. He was having a real hard time catching his breath when all of a sudden he heard Annie's voice behind him asking him what was wrong. He turned to look at her, and Annie instantly saw that Sean was completely terrified. He was as white as a ghost, just like Michael was when they went outside, and she knew something was wrong. Sean looked at Annie and said, "Michael wasn't lying. There's an effing werewolf on the roof. Get everybody in the living room. We're going to have to go. We cannot stay here. I don't know if this thing's coming in. Get everybody now. We have to go." Annie immediately starts screaming, which abruptly wakes up the other two. They come into the living room, and as soon as Michael saw Sean's face, he knew that Sean had seen the same thing he did. Sean looked at Michael and said, "You were right." And at that point, Michael, it looked like the blood drained from him too, because it was like this moment of realization that he was not crazy. He did see something outside. And he knew that if Sean looked like this, if Sean was this shaken up and this was his cabin, that they were in some danger. The four of them, they tried to make a plan on what they were going to do. They knew they had to leave, but their truck was a good 200 yards back down towards the road. And they knew if they tried to run, whatever this thing was up on the roof would get them. The four of them, they decided they would just wait it out overnight. They ended up basically huddling up in the middle of the living room of the cabin. Each one of them grabbed some type of a weapon, whether it be a knife or a fireplace poker, and they sat there all night. And all through the night, they could periodically hear this thing outside breathing underneath the door. They could hear it growling, they could hear it snarling. Occasionally, it would let out one of those real deep howls. And every single time this would happen, all four of them thought that this creature was just going to break down the door, come in and get them. However, that never did end up happening. Slowly, the sun started to come up, and as the sun started to come up, they noticed that they had not heard this thing outside anymore. So as soon as the sun was all the way up, the four of them, they just left everything in the cabin. They got all dressed, and then all four sprinted that 200 meters back down to the truck. Once they got to the truck, they abruptly made their way home. And over the next few weeks, they kind of refused to talk about it to anybody, even Sean's parents, when they asked why they came back so early. They just made up different reasons. They just said, oh, it was way too cold, or we just weren't feeling it, or somebody was sick. And they did not open up about this experience to anybody, including Sean's parents, for several months. They did a lot of research online to try to figure out what this was they saw, and what they came up with, what best matched the description of what they saw and what they experienced that night, was a dogman. Sean actually stopped going out to the cabin pretty much altogether, and to this day, he does not like going out into the woods. And if he does, it has to be in the middle of the day. It has to be in a well-populated place with a lot of people. John and Kevin were Minnesota boys, born and raised. They grew up in St. Claude, Minnesota. They grew up next door to each other, and they were best friends pretty much from the time that they were about 3 years old. Both of these guys growing up, they spent a lot of time fishing with their fathers. They would fish in the summertime during the open water season. They would ice fish in the winter. And it was like their number one passion growing up. Every chance they got, they were bugging their dads to go fishing. And luckily for them, their dads love fishing as well. So almost every single weekend, they would be out on a lake somewhere, whether they were out in a boat, they were fishing from shore along a river, or they would be out on the ice, fishing through a hole, trying to get lucky during the hard water season. Both Kevin and John, once they start to get a little bit older, they started to kind of branch out from the type of fishing that they would do with their fathers. They started going further away from home, going to areas that were a little harder to get to, and they would, more times than not, they would just fish from shore. As time went on with them fishing from shore, they decided, you know what, this is fun, venturing through the woods, taking these trails, going to lakes that people have never been to before. But you know what, we're kind of limiting our luck. We're fishing from shore, we're not getting out to the deeper water. We're not fishing in the bays. How are we going to do this? Should we get a canoe? Should we get a small boat that we could pull in behind us? And the two of them, they decided that they want to try kayak fishing. So the two of them, they saved up all their money as much as they could, and they went out and they bought a couple of fishing kayaks. From there, they rigged their kayaks up with electronics. They rigged them up with small electronic trolling motors. And the two of them, from that point on, they were pretty much limitless. They were able to go wherever they wanted, fish on lakes that nobody had ever fished before. But as time went on, they got a little bit older, into their early 20s. They were not completely satisfied with the type of fishing they had been doing. Yeah, they fished a lot of different lakes that nobody else had ever fished before. Some lakes that they didn't even know if they held fish or not. but they never found that one special spot that they could pretty much call theirs, where they knew if they went there time and time again, that they would have constant success, and somewhere where they could potentially set up almost like a permanent camp, somewhere where they didn't need to worry about lugging everything in every single time they went. So when they were about 24, both of them, they decided they were taking all their vacation time. They were going to head up to northern Minnesota and they were going to hit as many lakes as possible. They did a little bit of research. They looked online, they looked at maps, and they found a couple of lakes that actually looked like they were connected by a creek or a small river system. And they figured, you know what, if there's a river or a creek flowing into one of these lakes and flowing out of it, those lakes, they're going to have to contain fish. And, they're probably going to have some type of depth to them. We should go check this area out. So that's what they did. They ended up heading up about 3.5 hours north of St. Claude. They checked out this lake system. And sure enough, they came across this one lake where it was the first cast they took out. They hooked into a really nice pike and they were both pretty impressed. And through the rest of that day, they were pretty much catching fish cast after cast, whether it was pike or walleye. They even caught some bass. And the two of them, they're like, hey, you know what? We found our secret honey hole. We found our spot. And for the rest of that trip, they spent the whole day fishing. Then in the evening, come into the nighttime hours, they would spend the time basically clearing this big clearing right up along this big weedy bay. And that's where they were going to set up their semi-permanent camp. They ended up cutting down some trees. They used the logs from the trees to build a bit of an A-frame where they could put a tarp up over top. They cleared an area for a fire pit. And the two of them, they thought this was going to be their place. This is where they were going to spend their holidays going forward. Over the next couple of years, they made several trips out to this lake. And every single time they would go, it was like the fishing just got better and better. And they were just drawn into this lake even more. Come 2005, both of them, they decided, you know what? We've gone out to this lake for a week at a time, a week and a half, but we've never really spent more than a week and a half out there. Why don't we take 3 weeks? We'll go out to the lake. We'll go fishing for 3 weeks straight. It'll be an absolute blast. So they both booked off 3 weeks from work so they could go out on this trip. But then they realized they had a bit of a problem. To go away for 3 weeks, they were going to need a lot more gear than they would normally need for a weekend. So then a couple of weeks before their vacation, on the weekends, they actually made a couple of trips out to the lake. They brought out all of their camping equipment. They brought out a couple of big metal drums like you would use for bear baiting. And they ended up burying these drums right beside camp, about halfway down into the dirt. And inside these drums, they put their fishing rods, they put their camping equipment, like their tents, their sleeping bags, their camp stoves, just basically to keep them safe from the elements. Then they sealed them up. It was like their gear cache, just so they would not have to lug all of that stuff in when it came time to vacation. Once their vacation date did start, they ended up loading up their Jeep with all of their food. They put the kayaks up on the roof, and then they started that 3.5 hour drive up towards their honey hole. Now, where this lake is located, it's not located right off the side of a highway or right off the side of a paved road. It's about 60 miles down this long gravel road, and at one point you have to turn off this road and then take a logging road about 20 miles that zigzags through the woods of round lakes. And along that gravel road, basically from the blacktop to the logging road, there's one house. And John and Kevin, they associated that one house with their basically safety net. They knew if anything ever happened, they could go to that one house, but it would be a very long walk from that lake. And as they made their way down that gravel road, they saw that house pass by on their right. And they both knew from this point on, they were pretty much on their own. Again, this was 2005, so cell service, when you were out of the country, it was not that great unless you were in a fairly well-populated area of the country. But that far out in the boonies, cell service was pretty much unheard of. And again, they associated this house as their last safety net, their last connection to the outside world. So as they passed it, both of them kind of looked at each other. But at the same time, they were pretty excited because they knew this house, That marked the halfway mark to that logging road. Once they hit that logging road, it would not be long before they would be out on their favorite place in the world. So as they made their way down the rest of this gravel road, they started talking about all the fish they would potentially catch and just how great this trip would be. And both of them can feel themselves getting just more and more excited to be heading out to their favorite spot. A short time later, as they're going down the road, they spot up ahead on the left a small road leading off into the thick timber, and they recognize that road as being that particular logging road. As they got closer, Kevin slowed the Jeep, he turned it to the left, and once he was on this logging road, he slowed down even more. He shifted the Jeep into four-wheel drive, and then they carried on through the timber. Over the next little while, they really did not cover that much ground. The first part of this logging road was incredibly bumpy, so they were going fairly slow as the Jeep bumped around over top of logs, over top of rocks. Then they got to this one spot where the road basically became almost completely flat, almost completely smooth, almost like you were driving on just a normal gravel road. And at this point, they were able to pick up their speed. And they were actually able to get up to about 50 miles an hour down that one stretch of the road. As they were going down this stretch of the road, it abruptly turns to the right. So Kevin started turning the Jeep to the right. When all of a sudden, illuminated in the headlights in front of him, he spots what looks like a man leaning over something in the middle of the road. He abruptly turns the wheel to the left. He slams on the brakes. When all of a sudden on the front passenger side of the Jeep, he hears this loud thud, and whatever this was that he hit starts making the Jeep lose control even more, and he finds that the Jeep starts to steer off the side of this logging road into the steep ditch. The Jeep abruptly stopped when it hit this large pine tree, and both Kevin and John were flung forward. They bounced off the dash. And it took them a couple of seconds to kind of realize what the hell had just happened. As they pushed themselves up from the dash, they looked over at each other, and John could tell that Kevin was completely terrified. He was completely pale, he was white as a ghost. And John asked him, "Man, are you okay?" And Kevin, with his hands on the steering wheel, just staring directly in front of him, said, "I think I just hit somebody. I think I just hit a person." And John looked at him and said, "Dude, that was not a person. That was an animal. This thing had hair. This was some type of animal." And Kevin said, "No, whatever this was, like this was definitely a person. It was standing on two legs. It was leaning over something in the middle of the road. Like I just hit this guy. I don't know if he was a poacher. I don't know what he was doing. There was a deer on the ground. I caught a glimpse of that. But this was definitely a person." John was looking at him a little bit confused because what John had seen was clearly not a person. Whatever this thing was, leaning over something on the road, it was completely covered in hair. John again told Kevin, "Man, this was an animal. I think it was a bear standing over top of something, but it had hair. It had long black hair." And Kevin kept repeating himself that no, it was a person. So both of them, after a couple of moments, once Kevin managed to calm down a little bit, they slowly got out of the Jeep. They made their way up the embankment of that ditch, started walking towards where this person or this thing had been. And they could see on the middle of the road, they could see this dark shape kind of covering over the sand. Both of them, they took a small flashlight out of their pockets. They clicked a button, shone it down on the ground. And this thing lying on the ground was a deer. There was a dead deer lying in the middle of the road. The two of them, they made their way closer towards this deer, and then they realized that something just was not right. This deer was not just a dead deer. Its stomach had been completely ripped open, and its insides had been dragged across the road, and there was blood everywhere. Both of them, they were also hunters, so they were used to seeing deer dead on the ground. But something about this one just seemed completely different than anything they'd ever seen before. And both of them just stood there looking down at this deer, trying to make sense of what they were looking at. This deer had clearly been killed or clearly been clawed at and chewed on by something, because there was evident claw marks all over the back end of this thing, obvious bite marks as well. but its stomach was completely ripped open. It looked like all of its internal organs had been removed. And Kevin looked at John and said, "What do you think killed this? What do you think this was? Do you think it was coyotes or wolves?" And John's like, "Well, if it was coyotes or wolves, there'd be nothing left of this thing. They would have basically ripped this thing into pieces. I'm thinking this might have been a bear." And Kevin's like, "Well, if this was a bear, typically bears, they'll drag their kill off into the bush. They'll cover them with dirt. They'll cover them with leaves. They'll come back to it later. I really don't think this was a bear." And John's like, "Well, what I saw, I think that was a bear. It was big, it was black, it was covered in long hair. Like, I'm pretty sure this is a bear kill." Both of them kind of stood there for a couple more seconds just examining the deer. And they ended up figuring, you know what? Yeah, this had to have been a bear. And even Kevin at this point was thinking, you know what? Maybe when we came around the corner, what I saw standing there, maybe it was the fact that this bear was leaning over this deer. It looked like it was standing on two legs. That's why when we hit it, this thing took off. And he admitted, you know what? I think you're right. This had to have been a bear. This definitely was not a person. So the two of them thinking this was just a bear and that this bear had taken off when they hit it, they made their way back to the Jeep to try to get out of that ditch. They climbed into the Jeep, but when Kevin's tried to reverse back up out of it, it was just way too steep. It was way too mucky. It was way too muddy. And he just really could not get traction. The tires, even though he had mud tires on it, just were not gripping. And the Jeep just was not moving. At this point, John said he was going to get out. He was going to try to push, try to give him just a little bit more traction. So John climbed out of the Jeep. He went around to the front, ended up leaning up against the front of it. And he was pushing with all of his might while Kevin floored it in reverse. But the Jeep just would not budge. They kept trying this over and over and over again. And at one point, as Kevin had his shoulder up against the front of the Jeep, he was pushing with everything he had. All of a sudden, something just did not feel right. It was like he was struck with this undeniable feeling of dread. He kind of stepped away from the Jeep, started looking into the bush. He signaled to Kevin to kill the Jeep, to turn it off. Kevin turned the Jeep off. And John noticed that the area around them was just incredibly silent. And that put him on edge. He started looking around even more. He reached back into his pocket. He pulled out his flashlight, started shining it around, trying to figure out what was going on. After a few seconds of standing there, feeling that feeling of dread, he walked around to Kevin's door, opened it up, and he said, "Man, there's something not right. I think that bear's come back. I have this really weird feeling, like maybe we should just sit in the Jeep for a bit. Like something's just not right, man. Like the area is incredibly quiet. I'm having this feeling like I'm not feeling comfortable right now. Like I'm going to climb into the Jeep. We're going to wait a little bit." Kevin looked at John, kind of confused because John was normally the one of the two of them that was completely fearless. And he had never really seen him on edge of the bush before. So Kevin said, "Yeah, man, climb on in, we're going to figure this out. Let's calm down a little bit. Let's collect ourselves. I'm pretty sure we're just shaking, but yeah, climb on into the Jeep." So Kevin made his way around the front of the Jeep. He climbed back in, and the two of them sat there for about 20 minutes. And even after 20 minutes, Kevin looked over at John and asked him how he was feeling. And John still had that feeling of dread. And as Kevin was trying to convince John that everything was all right, he too started to have that feeling. He was trying to figure out, is this just because I know John has this feeling right now, or is there something going on here, something that I'm not aware of? They sat there for a few more minutes when all of a sudden John, while he was looking towards Kevin out the driver's side window that went up the side of that ditch, he spotted something standing right up on the road looking down towards them. So he reached over, he tapped Kevin on the shoulder, pointed out the window and said, "Dude, look out your window. There's something up there." Kevin turned his head, looked up in the same direction, and both of them sat there for a few seconds looking at this massive black mass that was silhouetted up against the moonlight, trying to figure out what they were looking at. When all of a sudden this thing stood right up, and this thing was no longer just this big black mass low to the ground. This thing had to have been about 7.5, 8 feet tall. And they could see in the silhouette of the moonlight that whatever this thing was incredibly muscular. It had long arms, it had big legs. Look, it had a big tail coming off the back of it. But one thing that really stood out to them was the fact that on this thing's head, it had these two pointy ears that looked a lot like German Shepherd ears or wolf ears. And they could see that this thing's eyes, where its eyes should be, were illuminating this bright amber color. And this thing was looking directly down towards them. Kevin, not taking his eyes off whatever this thing was up on the road, reaches over, opens up his glove box, pulls out a pistol from the glove box, leans out the window with a 357 Magnum, and fires one shot at this creature. This thing let out this blood-curdling scream, almost like a howl. It was so incredibly loud that both of them immediately had to cover their ears. And when this thing let this howl out, it ended up running down into the ditch, into the bushes, not too far away from the front of the Jeep. And as it ran down the side of the ditch into the trees, both of them got a good look at this thing. And this thing was definitely not a person, and it was definitely not a bear. This thing looked like a werewolf. It looked a lot like a Hollywood movie werewolf. It was this large, bipedal wolf-like creature, and it was running on two legs into the bush. One thing that really stood out to them was the fact that this thing's legs were incredibly muscular. They bent backwards kind of like a dog. And this thing, as it ran, was kind of hunched forward. Its arms were down in front of it. And they caught a glimpse of what looked like these long claws coming off the fingers. Both Kevin and John were completely terrified. As Kevin pulled his pistol back into the Jeep, he immediately pointed it out the front window at this thing as it disappeared into the bush. Both of them sat there for the next several minutes just completely terrified, and Kevin never once lowered his pistol from aimed out the window. Eventually, Kevin did say to John, he said, "What the hell was that thing?" And John's like, "I don't know. That thing looked like a werewolf. Maybe this thing is that thing that we've heard about when we were kids called a Dogman. That has to be what this thing was, because this thing was definitely a bipedal wolf. This thing was definitely a werewolf. This had to have been a Dogman." Kevin was completely terrified. So was John. And the two of them, they tried to figure out what they were going to do. They ended up deciding they were just going to stay in the Jeep for the rest of the night. And both of them, through the entire night, neither one of them actually even fell asleep. Kevin, the entire time, had his pistol up. He had his arms rested on the steering wheel. And both of them just continued to look all around them. Periodically through the night, this creature, this Dogman creature, this werewolf, would occasionally go back up onto the road, look down at the Jeep, and both of them, when that would happen, they would just sit there looking up at this thing. Obviously, shooting it with this 357 Magnum really didn't do a whole lot of damage to it, and Kevin only had a certain number of bullets, and he really did not want to waste them taking long shots up onto the road. So he conserved his ammo just in case this thing came up to the Jeep. Eventually, the sun started to come up, and they had not seen this creature for several hours. And the two of them started to talk about what they were going to do. They knew they could not get the Jeep out of this ditch on their own. And their only source of hope was to walk several miles, about 20 miles, back up to that cabin. So the two of them, once the sun was up, they got out of the Jeep, they headed up to the road, and at a fairly brisk walk at first, started making their way down that logging trail. The entire time, Kevin had his pistol up, looking into the woods. Both of them were expecting at any time this thing was just going to come barreling out of the trees, it was going to grab them, and they were going to end up like that deer. They walked almost all day until they got to that cabin. When they got to that cabin, there was actually somebody home, and there was this older guy. He had to have been in about his mid-60s, and he had this really massive 4x4 truck. They told them that their Jeep was stuck down that logging road, that they were going fishing, and that they needed help getting it out. And this guy could tell that both of These guys were completely freaked out. They just had that look to them. And he asked them what had happened. Kevin and John told them about this creature, and this guy pretty much just laughed at them, figuring that they were nuts. But he did offer to help them. So they climbed up into this guy's truck. They drove back down that logging road. They ended up hooking the Jeep up. And the entire time, this guy tried to pull the Jeep up out of that ditch. Kevin stood there on the road with his pistol out, looking into the bush. Once the Jeep was back up on the road, the two of them, they jumped inside. They basically just quickly waved to the guy, said thank you. They slipped him about $50, and then they floored it all the way back home. Both Kevin and John have not been back out to this lake ever since. And actually, they have not even gone back out into the woods. They used to be very avid anglers, very avid hunters. But this experience left them so incredibly shaken and questioning everything they believed in that they really do not feel comfortable going back into the woods anymore. Matthew was born in 1987. He grew up in Texas. His parents were incredibly outdoorsy, and same with his younger brother. But Matthew did not really fit that family image. He was not outdoorsy at all. He kind of kept to himself. He was more quiet, soft-spoken, gentle. He was not your typical boy his age. He was not all rough and tumble. He did not really like spending time out in the wilderness, even though every single summer his family would go away on trips and they would spend a lot of time hiking and a lot of time in the woods. Matthew, though, it always just felt unnerving to him. Every time he went off into the woods, he did not feel comfortable. His father tried, as he grew up, many times to get Matthew to be more outdoorsy, but it just was not taking. Every summer, his family, his mom, his dad, his younger brother, and himself would go up to Colorado for a couple of weeks. They would normally go to Rocky Mountain National Park, and they would stay at a place, which was the YMCA of Rocky Mountain National Park. They would rent a cabin, and they would spend a lot of their holiday hiking up in the mountains. And again, Matthew was not outdoorsy, but he did like spending time with his parents, and he did know a lot about nature. Every summer, when they would go up to Colorado to go camping, they would spend some time in town, some time out in the woods. And Matthew was a lot more happy when they would spend time in town. But because his parents were so outdoorsy, they would always drag Matthew and his brother. They would go on long hikes. They would hike to the top of mountains. They would hike along rivers. And Matthew, the entire time growing up, going on these trips, he always dreaded that portion of him. He always dreaded the hiking. It just was not his thing. And the summer of 1999 was no different. That summer in mid-July, him and his family made the trip up to Colorado. They stayed in the YMCA of the Rockies in Rocky Mountain National Park, which is located north of Denver and Boulder, Colorado. This area is fairly rugged, but it is incredibly breathtaking. It's filled with deep forests, long meadows, rivers. Now, there's a couple of fairly sizable peaks in this park. Where they were staying was not too far away from the town of Etz Park, and that was one area that Matthew liked to go to. It was kind of a fun, touristy town, and Matthew really enjoyed going there. When they were on this trip, they did spend some time in Etz Park, but they also spent a lot of time out hiking in the mountains. They did several hikes that ran up into the mountains. They even ended up crossing a glacier at one point. And even though this area was just breathtakingly beautiful, Matthew really didn't appreciate it. He basically walked, keeping his head down, not really paying attention to anything really around him. Then one day on this trip, they ended up hiking a trail they had never hiked before. It was on the eastern side of the park, and Matthew was not feeling it. He did not want to go, but his parents dragged him and his brother along. They got to the trailhead, they got out of their minivan, and then they started making their way down this trail up into the mountains. The entire time, his parents, his younger brother were looking around, they were taking in the scenery. And Matthew just was not feeling it. He did not want to be there. And the entire time, he was kind of complaining to his parents, basically saying that he didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be on this hike. And he was frankly getting kind of bored. One thing Matthew did notice on this particular trail was that they were passing several other hikers going both ways down the trail, which was something he really was not used to. As they continued to hike, Matthew continued to complain, and at one point he ended up saying to his parents, "I'm not hiking anymore, I'm going back to the minivan." And his parents knew that he would most likely, if he walked back down the trail to the minivan, he would only make it a short way. He'd probably get scared and he would be turning around and coming back up to them anyway. So, kind of amused and knowing he would be back, they said, "All right, go ahead, go to the minivan." Matthew said fine. He turned around and he started making his way back down the trail towards the trailhead where the family vehicle was parked. Now, this walk was not going to be short. It was a couple of miles from where he left his parents to get back down to the trailhead. And Matthew knew that he was going to be walking for quite a while by himself. And it did make him feel a little scared, but he was incredibly determined to make it back down to the minivan. So, with his head down, his walking stick in hand, he pressed on down the trail. And a short time later, he came to this one section of the trail that was way darker than the rest of it. When they were coming up the mountain, he did notice that this one particular spot was a lot darker. Off on the right-hand side of the trail, there was this big river that paralleled the trail. It was down this shallow embankment. And on the left-hand side was full of these massive bluffs of trees. And as he proceeded through this portion of the trail, he did feel a little uneasy, but he just kept pushing himself forward. A very short time later, that feeling of unease rapidly and very quickly turned into like this bone-chilling feeling, this bone-chilling fear. And Matthew had a hard time taking more steps. Every step, that feeling just got stronger. And he noticed that all the birds that he had heard before were now completely silent. Matthew started to have that feeling of dread, and he found himself starting to slow his pace more and more. And at one point, he stopped. That feeling was just way too overpowering for him, and he felt incredibly scared. He did not know what to do. He stood there on the trail for a couple of seconds, trying to think about what to do next, when he turned his head to look back down the trail in the direction he came. And in that moment, his blood just ran cold. He was completely terrified. He saw something standing right in the middle of the trail, about 30 feet away from him. Whatever this thing was, it was massive. He looked at it over his shoulder, so he only really got a glimpse of it out of the corner of his eye. So he turned around, looked directly in that direction, and he was just terrified as all hell. There was this massive creature standing in front of him. It was standing on two legs. It was completely covered in hair. The top of his head went up to a point, and this thing was staring right at him. Matthew stood there just frozen in fear, locked eyes with this creature, and this creature just stared right back at him. Matthew stood there looking up at this thing, just in awe with how impossibly large it was. It was about 8 feet tall, and Matthew, frozen in fear, staring at this thing, when all of a sudden this thing started moving closer towards him. It moved incredibly easily, bipedally on two legs, and as it got a little bit closer, that's when Matthew really got a good look at it. The clouds moved away, a little bit of sunlight started coming through, and that's when he could see this thing's face. He could see that its face did look vaguely human. It had dark eyes, it kind of had a flattened nose, it had black, leathery skin on its face, it had leathery skin on its hands, and this thing stopped just a few feet away from him, staring at him. It was so close that Matthew could hear this thing breathing, and Matthew didn't know what to do. He just stood there locking eyes with it. Both of them stared at each other for a few minutes. It was like this creature was trying to determine if Matthew was a threat. This young male with a club in his hand was a threat to him. But at the same time, this creature really did not show any signs of being afraid at all. It was more like it was curious. They stood there for a few more moments, and Matthew started to move away from it, and all of a sudden it turned, headed into the bush, and kind of disappeared from Matthew's sight. Matthew immediately just began sprinting back in the direction where his parents were, and he ran with everything he had. By the time he got to his parents, his lungs were burning. He looked terrified, and his parents could see that he was terrified, but they kind of laughed it off, figuring that he was just scared because he went off on his own and he didn't do well in the wilderness. and Matthew really did not tell them what he just experienced. So his family, not knowing what Matthew just went through, they continued the hike up this mountain, and on their way back down, when they got to that one specific part of the trail, Matthew again had that overwhelming, bone chilling feeling of dread. He found himself looking into the bush on both sides, expecting this creature to come out and get him and his family. He kept turning around, looking back down the trail, but there was no sign of it whatsoever. The family did eventually make their way back to the minivan. They headed back to their rental cabin, and Matthew did not tell his parents what he had encountered on that hike. Not a very long time later, his parents, they decided they were going to go on a hike on their own. So they left Matthew and his younger brother behind. They went to a trailhead. They started hiking up into the mountains. When all of a sudden they got to this one part of this trail where there was this big valley, and off inside this valley, they heard this loud, non-canine like howl. It was incredibly loud. And when they heard it, it basically struck them with fear. It shook them to their core. They did not know what this thing was. It did not sound like a wolf. It did not sound like a coyote. And his parents, upon hearing that, they quickly turned around, ran back down to their vehicle, and they ended up attributing this non-canine like howl to possibly being the ancestral scream of an Ute warrior. They were telling Matthew and his younger brother about this howl, and Matthew knew what made this sound. He knew that howl that his parents heard were definitely this creature that he had seen. Now, because Matthew was a little bit younger, he had no idea what he did see. But as the years went by, he did various trips back out to this same area, and almost every single time he would be out in the woods, especially anywhere near where he had this encounter, he would feel that feeling of dread. He would feel like he was being watched, and he did not want to go anywhere near the woods. And as he got even older, he started doing a little bit of research, and he discovered that what he encountered on the trail that day had to have been a Sasquatch. It fit the stereotypical image of a Sasquatch. Its behavior was very similar to lots of other encounters. This experience really did reshape his life in many ways. For years later, growing up at night, he would be terrified. He would have to sleep with his blinds closed. But what was even worse than this experience was the fact he felt like he could not communicate this to anybody. It was like he was holding on to this secret. He did not know how to tell anybody how he was feeling or about this experience. And for years, every time his parents tried to drag him off for a hike in the woods, he would try to find a reason not to go, because every single time he would go into the woods, he would have those feelings again. And for years, every time he'd be watching TV and there'd be a documentary or a show on Sasquatch and Bigfoot, it was like it would trigger PTSD-like symptoms. He would feel that feeling of dread. He'd be completely terrified. Movies would do this to him as well. And it really was not until he was in his mid-20s that he started talking about it to people close to him, including his parents, about that experience and about that encounter up in Colorado when he was 12 years old. Even to this day, now that he's a grown adult, every time he goes anywhere near the woods, he's hit with that feeling again. It's almost like he is still under this creature's control. It's like he's a 12-year-old kid again, staring up into its eyes. His parents have since relocated from their home in Texas. They've retired to a small cabin in a more wooded area of Texas. And the few times he has gone out there, he has had strange experiences. He's felt like he's been being watched, and he attributes a lot of that to being related to that experience up in Colorado. He has sent in a report of this experience to the Bigfoot Mapping Project website, and hearing a lot of different people's encounters on the various platforms on YouTube as well has really kind of loosened him up a little bit, made him feel a little bit better about this experience. And it has given him a lot of comfort that other people have gone through very similar things. Eric grew up just outside the small southwestern Ontario town of Fort Frances, right up along the United States border. And his family, they definitely were not well off, but they weren't really that hard off either. But money was pretty tight. His father worked in a pulp and paper mill right up along the border, along the Rainy River. So they've had to find ways how to save money wherever they could. And one way that they would save money was reducing their grocery bill. So their main source of meat was going out into the woods. They would hunt pretty much every kind of small game. They would hunt large game, and they did a lot of fishing as well. So Eric and his younger brother, they spent a lot of time out in the woods, even when their father would not be with them. They would go out in the back 40 and behind their house. Their family lived on about 60 acres of land, so a little bit shy of an eighth of a section. But Eric and his brother, they would always go off into the woods, going hunting rabbits, squirrel, grouse. They would take a 22 or even their pellet guns. Sometimes they would take their child type bow and arrows trying to get rabbits for the family. And the family themselves, they actually had this massive garden. It was about 5 acres that the entire family would work together, planting in the spring, and every fall they would harvest all their vegetables, and they would spend days upon days cleaning, washing, cooking, and pickling all of their vegetables so that they would have food to get through the winter up until the next season. But this was just a way of life for Eric, and it was a type of life that he loved. But as he got a little bit older in high school, especially the year he graduated in 2001, he was really looking to kind of make a change in his life. He did not know what to do. He really did not want to go off to college. But at the same time, he knew that he kind of wanted to get away from Fort Frances for a while. He wanted to see the rest of Canada, maybe travel different parts of the world. So he enlisted in the Canadian Forces. Unfortunately for Eric, while he was doing his basic training, 9/11 happened, and pretty much as soon as he finished his basic training, his unit was actually deployed overseas to Afghanistan. This was a bit of a shock to him. He was not expecting when he joined the Canadian Forces that he would very soon be going off to war. But he adapted really quickly. He really did excel as a soldier. He was pretty fearless. He really did very well at all of his military courses. So once he got back from his tour, he still had a few years of service left. And he was really trying to think about if he was going to re-enlist to the Canadian Forces once his enlistment ran out, or if he was going to try to find a different way of life. However, that decision was actually made for Eric fairly quickly because his unit did find out that they would be deploying shortly after his re-enrollment date. So he actually decided he did not want to go back to Afghanistan, even though his first tour there, they did not really see a whole lot of action, and a lot of his friends actually didn't make it home. He only had one friend who was wounded, but the entire experience really kind of shook him a little bit, and he did not think that was the life for him. So he released from the Canadian Forces, but he didn't know what to do. He didn't know if he should move back in with his parents out by Fort Frances, or if he should try to find his own property, find his own place, start his own life. And ultimately, he decided that that's what he was going to do. He would look for a property. He ended up finding a property just outside of Barwick, Ontario, which is located about 45 minutes west of Fort Frances. This property was a little bit bigger than his parents' place. It was about 80 acres, so an eighth of a section, and it backed onto pretty much endless woods. And Eric, the very first time that he went there, he just completely fell in love with it. Once he purchased the place, though, he realized he needed to find a job. He did have quite a bit of money saved up from his time in the military, from his tour, but he really needed something that would sustain him through the future. And he ended up getting a job at a local lumber mill located right in Barwick itself. So it was only about 10 minutes from home. So it was a real short commute. Eric, even though he was working, he was off on his own, he really did not give up his passion for hunting and for fishing. And pretty much every time he had time off for work, he would either be out in the woods behind his house hunting, or he would be going fishing. And it just so happened that on one of these fishing trips, about an hour north of his place up by Nestor Falls, Ontario, while he was fishing, he happened to see this girl fishing offshore only about 100 yards away, and she really caught Eric's eye. And now Eric was not the kind of guy that would just walk up to a girl normally and go and start talking to her, but it was something about this girl that he was really drawn in by. So he found himself kind of quickly reeling up his line walking along the shore, and he started a conversation with her. It turned out her name was Brienne, and after they talked for about an hour, Eric really developed a crush on this girl. She really liked fishing. She was into hunting. She actually lived not too far away. She lived in the town of Emo, which was really only about 10 minutes away from where Eric was living. And the two of them, they really hit it off. They basically started dating immediately. And very quickly, about a year later, she actually moved into Eric's house with them. He ended up proposing to her, and they were getting married in 2010. After their wedding, they actually ended up conceiving a child. Their child was born late in 2010, and they were incredibly happy. About a year later, Brienne once again found herself expecting, and they ended up having a second child. So now they had a son and a daughter, and the two of them, they were completely ecstatic. As their children grew in age, they found themselves being the kind of parents that would take the kids off into the bush. They would go out camping, they would go out fishing. And when the kids were only about 4 or 5 years old, they would just let them run around the yard outside. However, that quickly changed in about 2018 when their son was 8 years old, their daughter was 7. Their son started waking up at night saying that there was a man looking through his window. And now this would only happen about once every few weeks. Eric would be woken up by the sound of his son screaming from his room. Eric would get up, he'd run down the hall into his son's room, and his son would pretty much be cowering under his blanket, pointing at the window, telling him, "Dad, there's a man looking at me through the window." Every time this would happen, Eric, being a soldier, he basically would grab his shotgun, he'd run outside, he'd walk around the house, but he never saw any signs of anybody. And when he would ask his son for the description of this man, he would just say that this man was very big and he had really long, scraggly hair, and his face looked weird. His son would not elaborate on what that meant, but Eric was starting to wonder after a while, if his son was just having night terrors, if he was maybe looking for attention, because every time he would go outside, there was never any sign of anybody. And this went on for weeks and weeks, and every time Eric would run outside, there would be nobody there. After a while, Eric was starting to wonder, like, what the hell is going on? What is my son seeing? Is somebody actually coming up to his window at night? So he started looking around the property a little bit more in depth. And there was actually a cedar bush right beside his son's window. And when Eric was looking at the side of the house, looking at the cedar bush, looking at the window, he started to think, you know what? I bet I know what's going on. I bet it's windy at night. The cedar bush is moving. It's rubbing up against the window. It's waking him up. And the weird hair he's seeing has to be these cedar branches. This is the only thing that makes sense because there's never anybody here. So he went inside. He started talking with his son. He told his son what he thought, but his son was very adamant that no, it was not the bush, that there was a man with a weird face and long scraggly hair looking through his window. He said the man would come up to the window, he would start tapping on it, that would wake him up, and he would look up and see this man standing there. And he said this man was incredibly tall, and he would be standing there looking down at him, and it would scare him. That's why he would cover himself with his blankets and start yelling for Eric. Eric, though, was having a hard time believing that, just because the fact that where his son's window was about 7.5 feet off the ground, and there'd be no way for a man to be standing outside the window unless he was actually standing on something, and there was never any sign of that. So Eric just kind of tried to brush that off, and eventually later in the summer, his son stopped waking up at night. He stopped screaming and saying there was somebody outside the window. So after a couple more weeks, Eric, he kind of forgot pretty much all about that. He just basically went on doing his normal thing at night. He was sleeping through the night, and he was actually pretty happy about that. There was no more of these random 1 or 2 in the morning wake ups, and he was actually getting the rest that he needed to go to work the next day. Then come the middle of August, Eric, he had a couple of weeks off from work. His wife was not able to get time off. So he was trying to find things to do around the house with his son to basically make the last few weeks of summer interesting for his boy. And he came up with the idea of building this massive tree house right up along the edge of the property. Him and his brother, they had one just like that growing up, and he thought that his son would really enjoy having this fort up in the trees that he could basically go to whenever he wants. So Eric, working at a lumber mill, he managed to get some lumber at a discounted price, and he ended up building this massive tree house. It was about 10 feet up off the ground, had this big wrap around railing all the way around. And for a ladder to get up into this thing, he did not build a wooden ladder. He actually built a ladder out of rope so that when his son or his son's friends would go up into this treehouse, they could pull the ladder up, and he would not have to worry about any type of animals like bears or anything like that, basically being able to climb up and get to his son or to his son's friends while they were up in there. Once Eric was done building this, his son was absolutely ecstatic, and he spent pretty much every available minute up in this treehouse. And it was about the last week before school started. His son was really pressuring him, asking him if his friends could come over, if they could have a camp out up in the treehouse. And Eric, again, forgetting all about that man that was looking through the window, did agree to let his son have his friends over, that they could camp out up there. But there was one condition, and that condition was that they had to keep a walkie-talkie with them so that they could communicate with him and his wife back in the house. And his son and his friends were absolutely thrilled with this idea. So it was a Friday night. It was the last Friday of Eric's vacation. His son had a couple of friends over. They ended up having a bonfire. They roasted some hot dogs, had some s'mores. And then a little bit later in the evening, the boys made their way to the far end of the property. They climbed up into the treehouse, and Eric, standing back by the fire, actually could see his son start to pull that ladder up. Once that ladder was up, he pulled the walkie-talkie from his pocket and said, "All right, boys, have a good night. If you need me, just call me on the radio." Then with that, he turned around and he walked into the house himself to call it a night. Later that night, it was about 1:30 in the morning, their family dog, which was a chocolate lab, just started absolutely losing its mind. It started barking like crazy, and that woke Eric up. He found himself quickly setting up, kind of looking around, trying to figure out what was going on, why his dog was barking, when suddenly that walkie-talkie that was sitting on his nightstand crackled to life. And he could hear his son's voice coming through this walkie-talkie, and he could not make out what he was saying. He sounded incredibly panicked, incredibly terrified. Eric immediately sprung into action. He quickly sat up, ran to his closet, he grabbed his shotgun, he ran down the hall, through the living room, and out the back door. And as soon as he opened the back door, he immediately heard his son and his son's friends screaming from across the yard up in the treehouse. And the family dog actually booked it right past him and started beelining it directly in that direction. Eric was running as fast as he could, and all of a sudden he looked up and he almost froze in fear, almost just in utter disbelief of what he was seeing. Because at the base of this treehouse, he could see this massive silhouette of this huge animal that was standing on two legs, but it was looking into the treehouse. Now, this treehouse was 10 feet up in the air. So when Eric saw this, he did not know what to make of it, even though in his mind, his first thought was that it was a bear. And with that first thought of there's a bear looking into his son's treehouse where his son is and his son's friends, he quickly shouldered his shotgun. He fired a shot up into the air when all of a sudden this thing that was standing there lowered its arms, it turned around, looked right at him, and just from the light of the house, he could see that this definitely was not a bear. This thing was about 9.5, 10 feet tall, just standing there, but it did have a bit of a slouch, and it was completely covered in hair. It was incredibly wide. It had long arms, very muscular looking. Its face almost looked flat. And Eric did not know what to do. There was this massive creature right below his son and his son's friends, and he found himself again. He racked the shotgun, he fired a second shot. This thing let out this really loud guttural roar that Eric could feel basically resonate through his body. And as soon as it did that, it quickly turned and it started running on two legs along the bush line to the far side of the property and disappeared into the trees. The entire time this was going on, his son and his son's friends were absolutely hysterical. They were screaming at the top of their lungs. And when Eric saw this creature run and disappear into the trees, he basically gathered up as much more energy as he could to sprint the remaining 30, 40 yards to this tree. As soon as he got to it, he yelled up to his son to lower the ladder and to come down. But his son and his friends basically refused. They were absolutely terrified. They refused to lower the ladder. They refused to come down. And Eric had to basically plead with them, telling them, lower the ladder. Whatever that is, it's gone. Lower it, come down. Let's get inside. We got to go now. And eventually his son did drop the ladder down. But all three boys refused to come down. So Eric ended up having to climb up the rope ladder. He climbs on up, pokes his head into the treehouse, and all three of the boys were kind of cowering in the corner. And they looked absolutely terrified. Their faces were completely white and they were shaking. They were covered in sweat. Like, these boys were scared. Eric was trying to calm them down. He was asking them what happened, what that thing was, if it was a bear. And his son said, no, it was the man that looks through my window. When Eric heard that, his blood basically ran cold because now he knew whatever that thing was, it had been coming up to his house and it had basically been tormenting his son for weeks and months on end. And he really did not believe him the entire time that was going on. So Eric tried to plead with his son and his friends to come on down. And eventually he was successful in doing so. The boys ended up climbing down the ladder. Eric had them walk directly in front of him. And the entire time, Eric was walking backwards with his shotgun up, just scanning the tree line, scanning the entire yard in case this creature came back. Once they got back into the house and Eric and Brianne managed to calm these boys down, they again asked them what had happened. And the boys told them that they were sleeping up in the treehouse when all of a sudden the entire thing felt like it was actually going to tip over. It started to shake and pull to one side. So that's what woke them up, and they quickly sat up. And when they sat up from the light inside the treehouse, they could see these two massive hair-covered hands kind of on the edge of the floor of the treehouse pulling down. And there was this creature's face staring at them. And the way that they described this creature's face as looking is having very dark, almost sunken in eyes. It had a flat nose. It had a fairly large mouth that was full of very large, flat teeth. And its face was partially covered in hair, but its entire head was covered in this dark, almost ratty, unkempt hair. And they described the way that this thing's face looked as being like the mix of a person and a gorilla. Upon hearing that, Eric's first thought was that what his boy and his friends had encountered, what was looking into the treehouse and what he had seen, had to have been a Bigfoot. It had to have been a Sasquatch. He knew all about the stories growing up, but he never really believed them. He never really thought it was real. And even though he just saw what he saw and his kid and his kid's friends experienced what they did, he was still kind of in shock and having a real hard time believing that that's what this thing could have been. Over the next couple of weeks, Eric began talking to a few of the neighbors. He started talking to some of the guys at work, and a couple of people actually ended up telling him that there were actually several reports in that area of there being a Bigfoot, of being a Sasquatch. And then Eric ended up going online, looking up pictures, and he ended up finding one picture that he showed his son. And his son, basically, upon seeing the picture of the Sasquatch's face, immediately it looked like the blood drained from his face. He just turned white. He looked absolutely terrified. And it was in that moment that Eric knew that that had to have been what his son had experienced and what he had seen. Eric and his wife, Brianne, they did not know what to do. They did not really feel safe staying on the property. But at the same time, Eric was an ex-soldier. So he decided that, you know what, he had to protect his family, and there was no way he wanted to leave this property. He had lived there for years. It's where his son grew up. It's where his daughter grew up. And he was not ready to say goodbye to it yet. So Eric, over the next few months, he spent a lot of time basically wandering the bush all around the property, going deep into the forest and behind, looking for this thing. He would take a rifle with him, he would take a camera with him, but he never did come across this thing again. Now, all these years later, his kids are grown up, but Eric, his kids, or Brienne have never seen this thing again. And even his neighbors have not reported anything to him either.